This is a very popular talk, and I think we all know why. So it is my pleasure to welcome John Crain here to come visit us. John is responsible for executing strategy, planning, and execution for ICANN's external security, stability, and resiliency programs. He works on a cross-functional basis with the ICANN executive team, staff, and the community to enable and enhance capabilities that improve the overall security, stability, and resiliency of the Internet's identifier systems and associated infrastructure. He also represents ICANN in operational and technical dialogue and forums to ensure the full community engagement with these programs. Prior to his time at ICANN, John worked as part of the executive management team at the RIPE NCC in Amsterdam. We are thrilled that he's up from Long Beach. Yep. Thank you so much for being here, and we look forward to your talk.
Who writes that stuff? No, not me. It's probably one of our PR folks, or most definitely one of our PR folks. So I'm John Crain. I have a funny accent. I come from England originally, not from Amsterdam. Although I do speak Dutch, as I lived there for about a decade. They made me make a title. Has nothing to do with what I'm going to talk about. Don't worry about it. They made me make slides. Death by PowerPoint. I hate slides, but I'm going to use them anyway. So what I want to try and run you through is a little bit about where we got to today, how we got there, a little bit about what ICANN does. Who here has heard of ICANN? I'm sorry. Who here has been to an ICANN meeting? Oh no, I'm very sorry. Okay, they're actually quite fun. So, in fact, I see a couple of faces I recognize, so that's good. History of the internet in about 1 minute. This is very much from an ICANN perspective. So, you know, we go back to the early days, the 60s. Vint Cerf and a bunch of other guys trying to figure out how to move data around when networks get disrupted. Packet switch networks, as we call them. 74, TCP/IP, that's the main underlying protocol for the internet, was invented and deployed. 89, Tim invents HTTP. We could send pictures across the internet. What would the internet be without pictures? We actually got real browsers in 93, Mosaic, Firefox, Netscape, all these things came out of that. 98, the organization I worked for. So in 97, we had discussions about how we would manage the identifiers for the internet. When we say identifiers, we mean things like domain names, IP addresses, all the stuff that happens in the plumbing that nobody should really care about, but for some reason does. So ICANN was incorporated. So we're a 501c not-for-profit corporation in California. We're based in Los Angeles, have offices in Singapore, Istanbul, Brussels, Geneva, and many other places I forget. We're a very global organization today. In 98, I was working at the RIPE NCC, the Network Coordination Center. We distributed IP addresses within Europe and some other identifiers. And we were part of the discussion about forming ICANN, and I was part of that discussion. And in, I think it was the summer or the late spring of 99, somebody came from ICANN to our office, and I lent them an office, and they said, you know how this network thingy works. Can you come help us? And I looked out the window, and it was raining, and they promised me it would never rain in California. Turns out to be a lie, but I'm a sucker, so I moved. That same year, a company called Google was founded. Everybody takes these things like Googling and searching for granted, but these are all modern phenomena. 98, it's not that long ago. 2001, Wikipedia. You know, the thing that you're not meant to reference in any of your paperwork. Mark did Facebook in 2004. That's just over 10 years ago. Twitter, 10 years ago. This iPhone thing was in 2007. Weibo launched in China. And in 2014, from an ICANN perspective, is when the US government turned around and said, we're really fed up of you guys. You need to go off on your own. It's time to transition away from a government contract to being fully responsible to the public, to the community. 1998, when we were formed, that was the original intent. So we're now in 2016, and the contract finally expired, I don't know, about 2 months ago. Took us a while. There were lots of reasons why it took so long. Turns out that building up that trust and managing these boring identifiers is a little more complex than everybody thought, because people started using the internet, and in major ways. So this is something that was taken from statistics. This was a while ago, so it's probably grown. But you know, in any 60 seconds on the internet, this kind of traffic. I suspect during the election, the recent US election, which was, campaigns were done almost entirely by Twitter as far as I could tell, this was even higher. The amount of video, the amount of content that is on the internet these days that people rely on is just phenomenal. In 2013, there were 4.4 zettabytes. Who ever heard of a zettabyte 20 years ago? It's like we were lucky if we had a kilobyte or a megabyte of memory, and now they're talking zettabytes or zettabytes, so you probably call them over here. And they're saying we're going to have 44 zettabytes of data, i.e. content, by 2020. That's not traffic, right? That's just the actual standing still data. And there's a link here for where this came from. That's still old data, so who knows where it is now. So basically, this internet thing, I think, is a success. I'm not sure, but I think that people are actually going to use it. We always used to joke in the early 90s that nobody would use this thing. It would just be us. You know, we were the only sad individuals who had mobile phones and the only people who carried laptops. And if anybody had a laptop in the 90s, you know you had to have a pretty big lap. Yeah, I think this internet thing is going to catch on. So what was ICANN set up to do? Now, most of you have been here, so you probably know this. I've only got a few slides. Basically, we coordinate the identifiers of the internet, and we do that at a top level. We don't manage all domain names. We don't manage all autonomous system numbers, all IP addresses. We're just the top level. We distribute to other people who then distribute further. So it's an often misconception that ICANN manages the DNS or ICANN manages routing. We don't. We keep databases. Very small, boring databases. And we do that through something called the IANA functions. And up until recently, that was under contract to the US government, and now that contract's gone away. We got a lot of people from around the world into rooms, and they had convoluted and complex conversations that came out with nice, convoluted and complex bodies and organizations to make sure that we're managed. So we now have another organization that we have a contract with, but that is managed by a separate board that is built from the community. It's no longer a DOC US government contract. And I think a lot of people are happy about that, especially outside the US. The concept of having one government hold the contract, even though they never did anything negative with it, I mean, not even once, and they were always very accommodating and understood their role. You tell that to foreign governments and people outside the US, and they go, yeah, but they could. You know, in theory, they could do X, they could do Y. So that is now gone. We're now on our own, which is going to make it very interesting. Possibly changes some of our cover that you get by being a US government contractor. We are now fully a private entity. So it's going to be interesting lives for our lawyers in the future. Not that we've not been sued before, because we get sued all the time. It's just part of the job. But it's going to be interesting now there's no NTIA contract. So the three main areas, the one that everybody cares about, domain names. If you look in a domain name to the right of the last dot, which you never see, is what we call a top-level domain. You've all heard of .com, .net, .org, .edu, loads of top-level domains. There are now a couple of thousand of those things. I'm not going to give you my opinion on the value of them because that's not my job. But there's a lot of those, but we just manage that top level. So anybody who runs one of those, if it's what we call a generic, i.e. not a country code are the 2-letter ones. You ever see a 2-letter top-level domain? It's always a country code. Those don't have contracts with us, with ICANN. Everybody else does. We also manage IP addresses, IP version 4 and IP version 6. What we do is we distribute those to what we call regional internet registries. In this region, it's an organization called the American Registry for Internet Numbers, or ARIN. They get their addresses from us, and they give them out to the ISPs. We have no direct relationship with the ISPs for IP addresses. The same for autonomous system numbers, which are a routing identifier. And then there's a few hundred other identifiers that nobody cares about, because you never see them. But you use them every day. An obvious one is something called a port number. So when you go into a browser and you go to a website, you're normally going to a port number that represents where a service sits on a machine. 443 for HTTPS. Port 80 is supposed to be for non-encrypted HTTP, but gets used for everything. Those are supposed to be unique in their use. So the identifiers that we manage are either unique in who gets to use them, like a domain name or an IP address, or unique in how they're supposed to be used, like a port number. And there's more than 500 of those different identifiers. We don't develop the protocols that define those identifiers. That's another organization. It's called the Internet Engineering Task Force. We just run the boring databases. Unfortunately, it turns out that when you're using this internet thing, you have to use those identifiers. So life's not as boring as it should be. You know, if you go on a browser, if you type that IP address today, or this morning, because I tested it, into a browser, it will take you to a website just like if you typed in www.example.com. That's Google's homepage today. They could change that any time. Port numbers, as I said. Anything that can be used for good can be used for bad. Right, so if you're committing crime or espionage or anything else on the internet, just like when you're sending email or you're doing your Facebook updates, those people are also using identifiers. You cannot use the internet without using some form of identifier. It may be the plumbing, but you can't move water without pipes, unless you build aqueducts. But generally, you need pipes. Anybody heard of Conficker? Okay, so Conficker is a piece of software, malware, that's enabled control through domain names. They use something called a domain generation algorithm. I'm not going to get into it. There's a whole wiki here with a bunch of information about it. But they actually use domain names for controlling what we call these days a botnet. Right, so when things like that happen, people like law enforcement and security experts come to people like me and say, oh, look what they're doing with the domain name system. Help. How can we stop this? And you know, in Conficker specifically, we help by bringing security experts together with industry to try and disable those names. It's like 50,000 names a day across, I believe, don't quote me on this, it was a long while ago, 114 different TLDs, something like 100 different countries. Not easy. And this happens today all the time. So the policies that we set in ICANN can actually have effects on things like this. Registries that have contracts with us can't take certain actions because our contracts may forbid it. So ideally, you don't have those kind of things in contracts. What we had to do for Conficker was form a new policy, which is called the Emergency Registry Security Response, or something, or the expedited ERS, or we love acronyms. But that was a policy that was formed so that registries, top-level domain registries, can actually take action in the public benefit. It's a very simple policy. What it says is, if you need to take action that breaks the contract, come tell us and we'll waive the contract. And I've done 3 of those this week. So registries are taking action. So things like a registry may not be a registrar. The registrar is the person who sells and registers names on behalf of the end user. Well, in a botnet takedown, they need to do that sometimes. They need to actually register the names in a way that the bad guys can't. Technically, that breaks the contract. The process has to happen in 3 days. So, when they come to us and say, we need a waiver, we have to do it within 3 working days. There's language in there that says, if you don't get it in time, just go ahead. So we cannot be the bottleneck. There's also language in there that says, if you believe you have to do something for the public good, do it and come and ask forgiveness. Because ICANN's job is to get out the way. When things like this are happening that affect the public safety, our job is not to sit there and lawyer up and say, well, our contract says X, Y, Z. There's real people at the end of these crimes. So we get out the way. The policies we have are not perfect. This one particularly was put in place in an emergency. We will come across more problems as we go ahead, and we're going to need new policies. So we luckily have a lot of people involved in the security community today taking part in ICANN. 10 years ago, we didn't have that. So they help us form these policies. So who makes those policies? Well, it's certainly not me. I'm ICANN staff. We don't get to make policy. Our new CEO, we change CEOs about every 3 to 5 years. We're on CEO number 6, I believe. I tend to call them by their numbers. I've been there for all of them. They don't always appreciate it, but that's okay. We produce policy, or I should say you produce policy, through what is often called a multi-stakeholder or a bottom-up process. Staff gets to implement those policies, and we aid with the policy making process. If you need to have phone calls to discuss policies, we can set up bridges. If you need to have meetings, we organize 3 ICANN meetings a year where people get together and talk about whatever they talk about. Those of you who've been to them will realize that they are rather large. My first ICANN meeting was less than 200 people. If you go to an ICANN meeting now, it's getting close to 3,000 people in a meeting. You'd think these people would have other things to do, like Facebook updates and stuff, but we give them wireless so they can do them at the ICANN meeting. And it's amazing to see how it's gone from 200 people to 3,000 people, and it doesn't look like it's going to get any less interesting. 3,000 was like the last meeting, and it's the standard internet curve. It starts down here and it goes there. Anybody who's done internet engineering knows the curve that pretty much everything in the internet does. It goes, whoosh. That's what's happening with our participation, which is good. Unless you have to organize the meetings, which I don't. So I used to, not anymore. So what is a multi-stakeholder community? It's pretty much anybody who wants to take part. We do have some definitions to help group people together to do talking. By technical community, civil society, the people within the DNS business. DNS is definitely the core identifier that our policy is around. As an engineer, I think IP addresses are more important, but nobody uses IP addresses apart from strange people like me now. Everybody uses domain names and apps and things, but even those apps use domain names in the background. So the idea is that you bring this community together and they form the solutions bottom up. So the community comes with the policies, those get pushed up and they go to the board, and the board either ratifies those policies or they push them back with questions. Board doesn't really get to say no. They can say why, or can you clarify this, or can you clarify that? And staff can get up and say, well, that's an interesting policy idea, but to implement it, we'd have to turn off the internet, or it'd cost $50 billion or something. But apart from that, the community gets to set all the policy. It is slow. How many people here consider themselves policy people? A couple. Policy never gets made quickly. Not good policy. Good policy is a slow, slow process. I like building things. I'm an engineer. I can just buy parts and build something. If I want to build a motorbike, I can build it in 3 months easily. If I want to change a policy, I've got to think 2, 3 years. So this stuff is slow. It makes it frustrating for people who are not from a policy environment. They come in and they say, well, you know, I want to change X because it's obvious that this needs to be changed. Nothing's ever obvious. There's always something you've not thought about or some other perspective. And that's why you go multi-stakeholder, so that you can bring in all the perspectives. That means we have engineers. We have civil society folks. We have end users. We have ISPs. We have, well, that's horrible. I can't read that. Academics, industry folks. We have governments. We have a committee that is purely for governments called the Government Advisory Committee. Just like other committees, they are advisory committees. They don't get to state this is what the policy is going to be. They do input to the policy. That was very complex in the early days because governments are used to top-down processes. So when they come in and they are a government entity amongst all these other entities, it's a bit of a strange world for them. The Government Advisory Committee used to be the only closed meeting at ICANN meetings, because that's how governments function. Now, you go to those meetings. They're open. They've started to function just like the rest of the community. Very open, very willing to have dialogue. It makes for better policy making. I'm a big believer in multi-stakeholderism, and I'm a big believer in openness and transparency when you're trying to make policy. Because doing things in hidden rooms, you just push your own agenda and your own mindset. We do that as engineers too. And you're nearly always wrong when you do that, because there's always some perspective that you've missed. And it goes the same for anything you're doing, whether you're doing security work, you're doing engineering, or you're doing policy. You always need to bring in opposing perspectives so that you can balance yours against it and challenge your own ideas. And that works really well here. It's rowdy. It can get very noisy. It's contentious, and it's slow. Did I mention it was slow? Very slow. But at the end, hopefully you get good policy. We've not managed to break the internet yet. You know, we've only been going a short while, but we've not managed to break it yet. So if you're doing information security, or cyber security as people like to call it these days, which of the committees or groups are interesting? Well, I guess they're all interesting, but the more interesting ones are a couple of advisory groups that we have. One is the Security and Stability Advisory Committee. They've got a lot of documents. They advise the community and the board, just like any other advisory committee. And they've written on everything to abuse problems in the industry, to why we're not getting IPv6 deployed, problems around botnets, you know, very diverse. There's about 30 people, I think, on that committee. It's a committee where you have to be a member, because obviously they're dealing with security issues. Security people are paranoid. Anybody in here paranoid? You'll do well in the security industry. If you're not paranoid, you won't get far, because a little bit of paranoia is good, especially when they are out to get you. When we talk about the DNS, above the TLDs is another dot. It's what we call the root. It's interesting because it's unique. You don't get there by standard DNS processes. There's a special lookup that can get you that data, but you also normally have a file on your server that knows where the root servers are, the name servers for that part of the DNS. And they're not all managed by one organization. ICANN doesn't manage those. There are 12 organizations managing these servers in hundreds of locations around the globe. But we do have a committee which comprises those operators. I'm actually on that committee as the operator of LRoot, one of the 13 root servers, not as ICANN's security guy, so it's a bit of a weird situation, but I'm actually on both of those committees. And they advise around anything to do with the root server system and the DNS. So how will the expansion of new TLDs affect the root? Not how will it affect end users, etc. ESAC looks at things like that, but how will it affect the root server system, the distribution of the root zone, all the technical elements that go with publishing the DNS information. Once again, a lot of documents. Both of these organizations have documents, their membership is public. RSAC, the committee, is closed. Once again, it is member only, but we have something we call the caucus, and anybody can join that. And that's where all the work gets done. That's where all the documents get written, because we don't think on the committee, because we are actually the operators, that we're not necessarily the right people to do all the work. Once again, it's this thing about getting other viewpoints in to critique what you're doing. So we think that other engineers and people of interest should be on those committees and actually do most of the work, because we're lazy, get other people to do it. And we produce some really interesting documents. So from a security perspective, those are kind of the two groups that you want to go follow. Have a look at the sites, see some of the documents, and comment on them.
So question?
Yeah.
So let's take, for example, the DDoS attack last month. Would this fall under the domain of one of those committees, or is this seen as something that falls within ICANN's purview, or is it unrelated to ICANN, Dyn just had...
I'm going to get to that.
Okay.
I'm actually going to talk about Mirai,
okay,
which is the botnet behind that specific task.
Okay.
So that sort of got us where we are today. And I made this up this morning, and I couldn't think of a funny title, so my kid likes to watch Toy Story. So to infinity and beyond. Here is a highly technical diagram of what the internet looks like today and is going to look like in the future. The Internet of Things, like cybersecurity, it's a buzzword, it's marketing, ubiquitous networking, call it what you want. We are connecting way too much stuff to the internet. I'm not a sales guy. I'm a security guy. I have a lot of these gadgets because I like to play with them, and I have nice big borders around my network at home and go, ooh, shouldn't do that. Including one of the machines that was involved in Mirai. Mine wasn't, but I have one of those specific video recorders that was used in part of it. So, what does the future look like? Just insane amounts of things connected to the network. Not people, things. Lots of machine-to-machine communication, not person-to-person communication. We're already seeing this. Voice control in your home is now a commercial product. Right? There's multiple people that will sell you this. And those things are talking to databases and AI engines on the internet. There's nothing built into those things. Right? It's all internet. So, that's where we're going. And just like everything else when we get new technology, it's going to cause us all kinds of problems. So history has taught us that every time you come with a new technology, you come with new problems. There will be new attack vectors. Every time there's a new OS come out, things break. Every time somebody comes up with a new app, somebody finds a way to compromise it. That's just the world we live in. It's not new. All right? When people came out with new braking systems on cars, there were problems with them. When people came out with any new technology, there's always problems with new technology. Just really cool when it's online and everybody can get to it. So some things have already happened. So everybody's probably heard about the DDoS attack against Dyn. So Dyn is like a provider of dynamic DNS, registrar services, and a bunch of other services to large organizations. A lot of eggs in that basket. One of the most interesting things is there's a lot of eggs in that basket. And when you look at the providers of these kind of services, there are not many baskets. So you attack them, and it looks really cool. It's pretty spectacular. So dying was carried out, for the most part, as far as we can tell, by a botnet known as Mirai. Mirai exploited configuration problems in things, one of them being home video surveillance systems. The problem was, as an end user, you can't update those systems. Right. That particular video system, I have one. It is not connected to anything apart from my network. I've not figured out how to update it. I've been trying for about a year, way before Mirai. I've been playing with that device to try to figure out how am I supposed to update these things. Because our assumption is that when you buy something, it's going to be either secure or fixable. Now, you know, if you get a problem with the airbags in your car, you expect the manufacturer to do something about it, do a recall, fix those airbags. These devices that are out there now, you can't even update half of them. Well, not half, but there's a big portion of them that you cannot update. That is very, very scary. So we've already seen a botnet largely compromised of things that humans don't really interact with. Mirai, it's not the only one. There was another attack yesterday or the day before that looks like it was similar and may or may not have been Mirai. They're still doing the analysis on that.
So I guess my question is does this fall in the domain of ICANN? Is this something that ICANN feels that they have a stake of responsibility for, or is this something that's ultimately in Dine's and other providers' hands?
So
you just set up the rules like trust rules.
So device manufacture, right, which is where the problem lies, is definitely not inside ICANN's remit. Are we interested in it? Absolutely. You know, Dyn was a major DNS element that got hit badly. So, you know, when we talk about the stability of the DNS or the identifier systems, the DNS is part of that, right? So when we see things like a proliferation of devices that are just bad, for want of a better word, it's something we worry about, but we don't have any levers to do anything about that. Right? We're not the body that gets to define the safety standards for video recorders, right? Or any online device. Are we interested? Absolutely, because we're one of the victims, or our industry is one of the victims. Specifically in this case, Dyn was a victim and all of their customers afterwards. But we have no levers beyond talking to people that anybody else can do. So we can't actually do anything about that. And that's a big problem. And I will come further to that, but go ahead.
Okay, yeah, maybe you're going to get to this, but yeah, just to follow up on his question. So given that there's no easy way to kind of require fixing these devices, usually the way the industry works is large industry players realize that there's some problem that is affecting their services, and so a Dyn or whatever, a lot of, and they in turn put pressure on, in this case, equipment manufacturers. So I would assume that would start to happen. I would assume that it's not a really expensive fix, given how much intelligence. Is that true?
Well, for this case, it's an impossible fix.
Or are there going to be enough rogues out there selling equipment from, you know, through vendors who don't care, that it doesn't matter even if the guys say, look, you know, this is screwing up everything for everybody, let's deal with it.
So the problem is that the people buying the devices don't know about stuff like this, right? Yeah, so Dyn isn't buying this stuff. So, and this is not a new problem. We saw this in home routers, I don't know, 15 years ago, where they had bad configurations and we couldn't update them. And it took a long time before router manufacturers, and some of them are still set out with default passwords, etc. So that industry pressure is great in theory, but it doesn't seem to be working because we're still seeing this. I mean, those video recorders are old by video technology standards, but only, I don't know, a year, 2 years old. Well, I think I purchased mine 18 months ago. So clearly industry pressure is part of it, but it's not the whole answer. It's not working, and I will get to that part of it. So, you know, these things are out there. This is the future. These devices are going to be around, I don't know how long. I mean, how often do people upgrade their video surveillance systems? Like throw them out and update. How often do people upgrade their home routers? Yeah. Nowadays, there's been a change there, and that's that a lot of the ISPs are providing the routers, and they will manage them and do the updates. So, you know, there is a role here for the service providers, but it's not mandated, and some service providers do an excellent job of dealing with their problem customers. And most don't.
Yeah, so I mean, just as other ways that DDoS attacks have been addressed within the internet routing system or by service providers rather than attempting to fix every single computer in the planet. I don't agree that there are no tools available to try to address it, that it can't be addressed. There previous DDoS attacks have stopped. In fact, this one was blocked.
Yes.
Ultimately. So there are sets of tools that are available.
There are. They are
I'm
not.
not sure they're within ICANN's.
No, they're not. They're definitely not. But a lot of those tools, we do advise people to use them. You know, I mean, we do things like rate limiting on our DNS service, etc. Of course, there are tools, but big Western ISPs may have these in place, but the internet doesn't work that way. It's everywhere, and they always go to the lowest denominator. A lot of ISPs have never even heard of these technologies. They're certainly not mandated to use them. You know, we like to think that we're a responsible player. So, you know, a classic example is BCP38, right? The idea that you don't allow traffic to leave your network that didn't originate in your network. You know, that says it originated somewhere else, right? Wouldn't have helped in the Mirai case because they were using. Most ISPs don't do that. It's a cost with no benefit that they see to them. It's sort of the tragedy of the commons issue. That, you know, it's like everybody tends to worry about ingress, but nobody really tends to worry about egress. You know, these are all things that as engineers and as people in this profession we fully understand. But the majority of the people running networks don't. There's a massive education issue here, and I don't know whose responsibility it is to do that. And that's part of the problem. It's like, are there tools? Absolutely. Are they being deployed? Apparently not. Otherwise, we wouldn't have seen Mirai that attack take off in the first place, or at least be squelched very quickly.
I don't know if I'm getting ahead, but the T-Mobile issue yesterday. Do you know if that was DDoS or what happened there?
It looked like it, so I can only talk about what's publicly known. It looked like a DDoS. It looked like the devices may have been routers, home routers. We probably won't know for a few more days.
What happened?
They got DDoS. Took a bunch of their customers offline. Yeah. Yeah.
Home internet and telephone.
Yeah. And my prediction is we're going to see more of this.
So let me pose another question to you. What about China's DNS Poison? Well known throughout the internet community. It's done by a state actor against which an organization like ICANN may feel very weak, but does ICANN take a position on China's DNS Poison?
Nope.
Even though it's been shown to sometimes have third-party effects outside of
so when they had third-party effects, my team did talk to people. But you know what a nation does inside its nation state is not something ICANN's ever going to get involved in. Okay. For example, when nations have cut themselves off, we have talked to providers outside who are trying to keep the DNS up and running. you know, we work with people, but ICANN's not going to take a position on those things. Our lawyers have never let us. It's also, you know, it's not our remit. Now, if they were doing massive damage to the ecosystem, that might change. But nobody's done that yet. I mean, we've had some interesting things happen from China. We had a root server that seemed to not be getting queries, etc. And the operator dealt with that. It never got to the stage where, you know, people couldn't get to their content.
Given that SAC and RSAC are advisory committees, and simply as ones like providing public documents that want to consume as well as the private coordination function, can you talk about security issues which have been addressed by these committees and which they have?
So they have talked about previous attacks, and I suspect that SAC will probably talk about the Dyne attack. They will probably document this, and they, as an advisory committee, they are free to write advice about whatever they want. Right? They are not ICANN staff. You know, we don't set policy, we implement policy. If they could force a policy change that meant that we had to do something when something like this would happen, I don't think they will, that would change our standpoint. But as staff, we don't get to set these policy standards. SAC can write advisories, those can go to the rest of the community. Sometimes, you know, they wrote something on BCP 38. I think they wrote 2 documents on BCP 38 saying, IS, please do this. And what we're doing within the ICANN realm is, firstly, we do it on anything we run, and then we talk to the registries and say, well, we'd like to see this as something that you guys should do on your networks. It's not going to solve the problem, but at least we're doing our bit. But, you know, we don't have any say as staff over the ISPs, but SAC can write about anything they want. So they've written a lot about deploying DNSSEC, deploying IPv6, BCP 38. There's a whole list on that thing. There's 100 and something documents. Some of them are very precise to ICANN policy issues, but many of them are very wide-ranging. I've not seen anything come out on the Dyne attack yet, but I would be stunned if they're not writing something. They have various working groups.
As a follow-up, to what degree do they also act as private coordination mechanisms, like when an attack's on its way? Is the RSAC drawing upon that community?
No. They, I mean, that's the role of certs and organizations like that. ICANN is not a cert. We did discuss, God, you're digging into my old memory here, about 8 years ago, I believe, the concept of a cert for the industry. I still have the knife wounds. You know, we did suggest that as an industry, we should probably have some kind of coordination function that is not ICANN that dealt with these. Yeah, that didn't go down too well. So that is off the cards for now. But I've heard murmurings of people saying, well, you know, that idea you guys had like, you know, 8 or 10 years ago, and I go, don't want to touch it. You just got to come from the community. So there is some discussion inside corridors about the need for more coordination. RSAC is an advisory committee. The root server operators, of which I'm one, we have that kind of coordination. I mean, I can literally get every root server operator on the phone within 2 minutes. And we test this constantly. And when we get attacked, obviously, we don't need to do a test that month. So those coordination capabilities are there, but they're not an ICANN thing. But you know, there's large organizations that do deal with certs like FIRST, and you know, of which we are a member. We have a internal cert and we are a member of FIRST, so we interact with that community. And we teach that community about how the industry works, but it's not ICANN's role to do this. Now, members of SAC are, of course, security practitioners. So some of them will be from certs, some of them will be from private industry security things. So they will be involved in that, but not as SAC members. So there's always this thing about where you need to divide what ICANN does as just a policy formation body and what the people involved in ICANN do.
There's about 3 minutes
Yeah,
left.
all right.
Can I just ask, what do you regard as ICANN's security victories? Because we've been talking a lot about what ICANN can't and can't do. What do you regard as the chief victories that ICANN has achieved in the security space?
I'm trying to see which ones. I'll go to that in a minute. Firstly, we've not broken the internet, which is always good because it's not for a lack of trying. So I think one of the key things that's happened in the policy realm is that we've actually brought law enforcement and public safety groups into the ICANN policy realm, and they actually have an official place now within the Government Advisory Committee. We didn't have that 10, 15 years ago. When I started at ICANN, the only time we saw a law enforcement agent or a policy person from law enforcement was when they thought we'd hacked somebody at 10.0.0.1 private, those are all registered. All the private IP address space is registered to the IANA. So when somebody uses a private IP address, they come knocking on our door. Now, if you go to an ICANN meeting, you will see dozens of agents from around the world, not just the US, but international law enforcement agents, and people like the FCC and other public safety organizations in a room talking about how they can affect the policy. And they're actually writing things into the policy and making advice that gets incorporated into the contracts. So I think that's probably one of the biggest shifts, and we're seeing more and more of that. And what we're currently seeing is a battle between, well, a battle's not really the right word. We're seeing a discussion between the public safety aspects and the business aspects of the registration of names and numbers, and we're seeing not really a coming together, but a sort of a tacit agreement that things have to be done. We have provisions in our contracts that talk about dealing with abusive names. We have some definitions of what those abusive names are. We didn't have those 10 years ago, or even 5 years ago. Some of these are very new. So I think that's very good from a security perspective, that we actually have those experts coming in and participating in the security realm. Because without those, we just keep making what's good for the business, and it's not just about business. So I think that's probably the biggest thing. There's been lots of individual things. We work on Configure. My team specifically does take operational roles. If law enforcement comes to us and say we have this problem, we will be a subject matter expertise for them. We don't want them breaking things. If you've seen some of the takedowns in the past, ICE did a phenomenal one where they took down all kinds of infrastructure they didn't mean to. So, we get involved at that level. But where we really work is in the policy realm. And the biggest victory there is actually getting law enforcement to turn up and to be willing to engage with the rest of the industry. And it wasn't easy, because people are cynical about getting involved in policy because it's slow. I think I mentioned it was slow. I've only got a couple of minutes, if that. So some of the issues that I see here, there's everything that happens on the internet these days is interjurisdictional. When there's crime, it's very, very uncommon that something happens just in one country. So if you're in law enforcement and the legal elements of public safety, they have to learn to operate across borders that they normally wouldn't. And yes, we have MLATs and we have processes, but everything that is being built for dealing with international law is slow, and it doesn't match today's technology. And that's the main thing, is society needs to catch up. Public-private participation is something that, this collaboration is something that governments always talk about, the public-private partnerships. But that generally means you give information to the government and nothing comes back. That's changing. We're seeing more and more two-way communication between the industries that actually run the internet, right? It's nearly all corporations and privately run, and law enforcement and governments. So that's getting better, not where it needs to be. Standards and regulations. I hate regulations because I'm an engineer. I like riding at 150 miles an hour down the freeway. It's probably not a good idea. It took decades for us to introduce modern safety standards into all the other industries. motor vehicles, it wasn't until the 60s that we standardized on safety belts. They've been around as accessories since the late 40s. But you didn't have to have one in a car until the 60s. And cars have been around for, I don't know, 70 years by then, since the first cars. You didn't have to ground or earth electrics in homes, according to the codes here in California, until the early 60s. You wouldn't think of doing it that way now. These things take time. We don't even have the agencies that make the regulations for hardware safety. I don't think we even know what it means yet. So we got a long way to go there.
We're about out of time.
Yeah, we're about out of time. So I'll talk to this. So most of these, and this went directly to the question, are not direct ICANN issues. Most of the issues with online security are not things that ICANN is going to help with, but people come to us because there is nowhere else. We don't have the remit, and most importantly, we often don't have the skills to deal with this. 90% of ICANN staff are bureaucrats and policy folks. They're not security folks. It's not our major area of expertise. So, you know, the idea that you can come to ICANN to solve world peace, somebody actually asked that at the microphone. It's like, what are we doing about some war situation? It's just not realistic. It's not what we are. We manage databases and policy for those databases. How do you participate? I'm going to leave these slides. There's a bunch of things. The main thing I'd say is if you're involved in security, get involved in the communities. The one tool that you will have going forward is the people you know. Security still operates on what we call the Bubba net, sort of a military term. The people you know that you can phone up to do things. You're not going to be an expert in all of the areas of security. It's a highly complex environment, but you need to know people that are. So if there's one thing you do as you go forward with your career, meet people. It doesn't matter whether you go to some of these meetups or you join InfraGard, or there's even a cyber students organization I found today, which I'd never heard of. Meet your peers. Get to know them. The only way we ever manage to take action is by phoning people we know. It's very rarely that it's, well, there is a policy that allows us to do X, Y, Z. It's normally you phone up somebody and say, hey, do you know how to do this? So if there's one piece of advice I can give, that's it. Meet your peers, go out there and exchange business cards and work with them. You know, the more you work with people on real issues, the more trust you'll build. And trust is really hard to build, and it's one of the most important things you can do if you want to be a cybersecurity or a security practitioner.